Hi, welcome back to Hope 2020. We've got a great show for you right now. We have Christopher Flatley, who is a uh, preeminent cybersecurity doctor at SUNY Rockland here in New York. His discussion is securing a remote workforce in the face of COVID-19 and planning for the future. Take it away, Christopher.
Hello. So I'll be talking about a remote workforce and planning and securing it for the future. A lot of what we're dealing with now is kind of unprecedented. Well, shouldn't even say kind of unprecedented. It's completely unprecedented what we're dealing with now. So there's a lot of things that have come up and things that companies have realized throughout this that have really made us more aware and kind of crafting the way that we're going to respond in the future. A lot of people don't want to stay fully remote, but it's given us a lot of lessons that we can take and apply to disaster recovery, business continuity, and other concepts other than just dealing with a pandemic situation. There we go. So I'm the owner of a cybersecurity company based out of New York. My company maintains about 4,500 endpoints in 3 different countries that we maintain and do 24/7 remediation and response for any security threats or anything that's going on with them. And we've seen about 37% increase in attacks across all of our clients nationwide, particularly in the United States. I'll focus on for the purpose of this talk, because that's where all my data is pulled from. So we've seen about a 37% increase in attacks on those clients. Now, these attacks have ranged from RDP exploits to people just trying to get into their web servers to mail servers. Really the whole gambit of people trying to take advantage of the COVID-19 situation, people working from home, and people kind of adjusting. A lot of people aren't as familiar with the procedures from working from home, or maybe more likely to open an email that says, hey, here's our COVID procedure, or click on this to get resources for COVID, than they would be during a normal situation where everything is business as normal. I'm also a full-time professor for the State University of New York, where I teach cybersecurity classes and coach the ethical hacking team that we have there. So cybersecurity threats that I'm going to say throughout here is pretty current as of right now. But as we all know, cybersecurity threats are a constantly evolving and changing metric that you really can't pin down and can't just learn without continuing to learn and research. So I may say things in here, or may talk about different protocols or programs that are vulnerable now that may not be vulnerable tomorrow, or may be safe now and may not be safe tomorrow. It's an ongoing process of learning what's safe and what's not. So please, if you're looking at this talk and taking notes and trying to figure out how you're going to implement your own strategies, do your own research, focus on your industry, what the risks are to you, and really just making sure that everything is current. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the obstacles in the beginning, and then we'll move towards RDP, where I've seen kind of the most attacks and most vulnerabilities present themselves. So the biggest problem for all businesses, especially when COVID-19 started, was the lack of local or access to local resources. And what I mean by that is servers, printers, scanners, all the things that when you go into an office, you take for granted. You go into the office, your computer's at your desk, or you bring your computer with you, and now you can access the file server that sits on the same network. You can access the scanner, the printer, all of the resources that are there when you get into the office. Your home is now your office. Everybody doesn't have the home server or doesn't have the office server sitting at their house. So we needed to deal with, how do we get people access to these resources? More importantly, how do we get access to these resources securely? Which brings us to our next problem, or a sub-problem of local resources. No VPN access and no VPN set up and configured. So most businesses, if they're operating brick and mortar, you go into the office, don't really have VPN capabilities, virtual private network, the ability for workers to connect remotely into their environment and act as if they were on the company network. So if you don't have that capability, you start looking for other solutions, and which we'll discuss in a little bit. Even bigger problem is companies that had an existing VPN. Now, I say that's an even bigger problem because I'm coming from the IT side. And from the IT side, we look at the C-level executives and they go, make this happen. And we go, no, sorry, that's not possible. And they go, well, we think it is. And that's what we have to put up with. So companies that already had existing VPNs, already had the ability for some of their workforce to work remotely, was running into problems with executives basically saying, well, we already have 5 people work remotely. Why can't we have 500 people work remotely? Not understanding the limitations of technology or what that actually means from a technical standpoint. So sometimes when I was having conversations with clients, it was actually easier to take them from nothing to having a proper setup than it was to convince them that their setup would not suffice and would not support the number of employees that they needed to be having work remotely. Providing take-home technology. If anyone tried purchasing a laptop or tried purchasing really any tablets or anything in the beginning of COVID, most resellers were out, especially the ones that have pallets of laptops normally sitting around for enterprises to just buy on hand. It was really hard to get laptops, especially for a fair price. The price just skyrocketed on enterprise laptops. So getting the take-home technology, also freeing up a budget to buy the take-home technology, became very difficult to do because the situation skyrocketed, especially in New York, where everybody just went home and didn't come back to work one day. A lot of the support that we did was in offices that haven't had employees there for months now, and we're going in and everything's left. It's eerie. Everything is left on the desks as if they were coming into work the next day, because some of them didn't realize they wouldn't be coming into work the next day. So getting that technology and making it available for them to bring home is another issue. Where does the company's IT responsibility end? Companies had to navigate what tickets are actually theirs. If a user is complaining that their internet isn't working, well, normally that would be IT's issue. But is the internet problem actually with the home ISP, or is it with the connection to the VPN or connection to the company's resources? A lot of times, especially with people having cable and the amount of saturation on those networks, we ran into a lot of problems with people not being able to connect or not being able to get proper speeds or their internet just dropping. ISPs were putting out some reports that showed that their peak numbers that they normally hit were now their sustained numbers because everybody was working from home. And their networks weren't built to cope with that. So you were having outages everywhere. The optimum outage map for New York was basically just a big orange blob. So every time a client called and they're like, hey, people can't connect from home, we look at the map and we go, yeah, you're in an outage area. We'll come check it, or we'll try to remote in and see what we can do. But you might just have to restart your modem and wait for it to come back up online, because Optimum is doing everything they can. Which ties right into the slow bandwidth speeds. So failing to plan is planning to fail. Something I like to say, never to clients, but oftentimes to the people behind the scenes, because these companies don't plan properly. Now, not everyone is going to plan for a pandemic level situation, but that's not the problem. What we actually saw was that people had a lot of solutions put in place that they would be able to use. And for disaster recovery, you have to plan to work remote, or you have to plan if something happens to your physical location. So we actually saw that people had plans, the ones who had actually put proper plans in place, to move their workforce remote or allow their workforce to continue. Now, these plans had to be tweaked a little. They didn't necessarily take into account not being able to be in the office for several months at a time. It was more of a short-term, in my case, short-term recovery plan where they were focusing on moving to a new location for a short period of time before getting back into the office. But they did have plans in place, some of them. The ones that didn't are the ones that we saw scrambling. And that's where mistakes got made, and lots of them. And I'm not just talking about my clients, because I'm not going to say my clients didn't make any mistakes. I had a couple that would just take computers home without calling us. One of the managers made a call, and he was like, or made a decision, and he told all of the employees, oh, you guys have to work from home, so just take the desktop and the monitor from your workstation and bring it home with you. No one saw any issues with that until the desktops got to the house, and now they're paperweights, because we had so much security on them to prevent them from connecting to any rogue networks, to make all the resources only accessible if they were on the local network. And now all their desktops were at home. So we couldn't actually provide any support for them because our remote connection tools weren't even working because they wouldn't connect to the internet. So then we get a call from that company, why can't we log in? Well, because you never asked us about bringing your desktops home. And then they're like, okay, well, give us a way to remote in or to connect to the office. Well, you just took home all of the desktops that I would normally have you use to remote into. So I don't know exactly what you want me to do. It's going to be a very expensive solution. Because now we need to spin up some virtual machines on Azure, have a VPN set up, and have a site-to-site link. Now it's going to be really complicated, which I have to say they weren't thrilled about. But that's what happens when you have people who don't have IT experience or don't have any technical experience making some of the decisions related to IT without consulting with the people who have to do the implementation. And I know a lot of IT that I've spoken with, a lot of friends and colleagues in the industry have faced this same thing. There's a disconnect between what IT is capable of doing and what the management believes should be capable of happening. For some of the companies that we support, just to address one of the questions, for some of the companies that we support, they've told their employees, don't plan on coming in until November, maybe December. You know what, we'll probably not even finish, we probably won't be in the office for the year. So one of them in New York City, probably 3 months ago, just got another office space, a couple floors up from them in the same building. And they're now looking at removing that office space again because they have the capability for a lot of these people to work remote. A lot of what we're seeing in the kind of limitation to people working remotely is people stuck in an old mentality or stuck in a mentality of, well, you work in finance, you have to be on site. Well, we have a lot of technology at our disposal. We have a lot of ways to secure data. We have a lot of ways to provide them this remote experience. You know, some of the finance companies that I work with have actually sent the computers home, have provided a complete workstation for their employees at home, because essentially for them, they're like, okay, it's the same expense, except now we don't have to pay for any of the expenses of them being on the property. We don't have to pay for all the lights to be on. We don't have to have 100 square feet of them for them to work in. All of these different things that they now don't have to do for an on-site employee. They're like, absolutely, we'll send you home with your workstations. So a lot of it comes down to management, not necessarily technical limitations. I believe that past COVID, we'll see a lot more remote work. And then at the same time, we might see an overcorrect of companies trying to drag all their employees back in. We have a couple people now who are fully set up to be remote, and they're like, we want our employees in immediately, but they don't need to be there. It's just the manager wants to see the employees, wants to be able to make sure that he knows they're working and keeping an eye on them. So in general, larger companies, I think, are going to adapt a more hybrid remote workforce model, maybe not entirely remote, but maybe you'll come into the office every couple or maybe 2-3 days a week and be able to work remotely for the other 2 or 3 days. And smaller companies, I think, will still jump back to the in-person workforce because they don't want to spend the money on IT. They see it as a large initial expense, and for many companies, IT is kind of a black hole where money just goes and they don't really see the profit. Because IT doesn't have a line item of sales or how much money they brought in. IT is there to support the business. So for them, they see it as a black hole. So when you don't have a VPN, or your VPN is not capable of handling the amount of users you need, or doesn't have the throughput, whether it's the VPN or your actual internet connection, people started looking at third-party remote desktop tools. They started looking at like TeamViewer, AnyDesk, Chrome Remote Desktop. I'm sure everybody can name probably 10 of them off the top of their head that we've all now heard of, and their advertising has really been ramped up. So they start looking at all these third-party tools. Now, third-party tools are great, except when IT doesn't get proper management over them. So the companies that we work with, we don't always have complete management over their IT infrastructure. A lot of times we just support them. And we'll be looking at computers and we'll be like, is there somebody accessing this computer remotely? And they'll be like, we don't know. And I'm like, well, there's TeamViewer on here and I can see that it's connected to a session. And they'll have no idea that their employees have remote access or what tools they're using. When you don't centrally manage that, what happens when an employee leaves? What happens when you have to fire an employee and now they have a remote access tool on that computer that isn't directly linked to company accounts? You know, if you're using the Chrome Remote Desktop, that links to a company account. If you're using G Suite, we can lock that out immediately and stop the user from accessing it. But if they have their own TeamViewer account set up on there, they have their own AnyDesk, any of these other free alternatives, they now have a backdoor into our network through what is seen as a legitimate access tool. So it's not like an antivirus is going to pick up TeamViewer and go, hey, wait a minute, you have TeamViewer, because TeamViewer is a legitimate tool. That's kind of one of the scary things that people don't think about. They're like, I got hacked. And it's like, well, you didn't get hacked. You got connected to by someone, a malicious insider who shouldn't have had access. And then Windows Remote Desktop, which I'm going to focus a lot of time on because everybody loves Windows Remote Desktop and doesn't really understand their limitations. It's already built into Windows, so every place that needed to do a quick and dirty solution found this to be the easiest thing they could possibly implement and make work. And then the other thing we saw is if your VPN can't handle the traffic, just remove the VPN. Sounds like a fantastic idea to me. Why do we need the VPN? It's only making things secure. Let's just have everyone connect directly. And that's where the really big problems came in, with people allowing direct connections to their network and making it possible for these people to, or for end users to just connect directly to machines. They're connecting directly to the router, firewall, having those connections forwarded to their machines, which means everybody can get to those connections and everybody can try attacks on those connections. Security through obscurity is a phrase mentioned a lot when it comes to RDP. Remote Desktop Protocol operates on port 3389. It's a known port. Everybody knows that's what it operates on. All the scans I'm going to show you come from scanning this known port. What people will do, because they think that they're sneaky, is they'll take this port and they'll change it. And they'll say, hey, instead of connecting on port 3389, we're going to connect on port 1111 and make it so that nobody would know it. So if you're scanning, you're not scanning their particular port. The problem is that technology has progressed so far that I don't need to worry about, or I don't need to limit my port scans to only one port for it to be effective. There are so many tools out there that make it really easy for me to just search and find anything that's running on the internet. One of those is Shodan. It's an internet search engine for essentially internet connected devices. So if you think that, oh, I'm just one person or I'm a small business, nobody's focusing on me, you're right. Nobody is focusing on you. Nobody cares to focus and target you. However, attackers don't manually do this. When we're doing our security testing, we're not manually going through and typing each number in. We're not manually going through and typing each password. We have tools for that. So we can use search engines or products like this that will allow us to grab massive amounts of data in and then run our automated tools against it. So you can see here, using that tool, I searched for 3389 for RDP. I focused it on the US and New York, and I got tens of thousands of results. I think last time I ran it, I got like 25,000 results. And you can actually see the desktop of the people that you would be trying to log into or that are exposed to the internet. Now, I should mention that connecting to these desktops and any unauthorized use is definitely a crime. The big use of Shodan is for security researchers to see and grab this information so that we can actually form these talks and form these kind of trends of how RDP and how different services are working. I actually use this to monitor my clients. They have a really good API that allows me to use it for my security testing as well. But you can see someone's desktop here. If they had a username there that was let me know the name of their company, or they had it on a domain, I would be able to know exactly what company that belongs to and know that it's exposed to the internet. So this is obviously really bad. Anytime I can see someone's desktop that they don't want me seeing it, that's a bad day for anyone. And you can see I took out the IP address. I'm not trying to make anyone's life easy. For VPNs, when you're configuring them, one of the important things when you're considering bandwidth, answer one of the questions here, is it's not really a rule of thumb that necessarily I go by, because it really goes by the data that you're transmitting over there. So clients that are doing graphic intensive, maybe they're doing CAD work, or maybe they're connecting to mail servers or things through VPNs, they're going to need much more data than you would if you're just doing a regular remote desktop through a VPN, which is secure. If you connect to a VPN first and then use remote desktop is a fantastic tool. I'm not hating universally on remote desktop. I'm hating on the way that people implement it and expose it directly to the internet as it was never ever supposed to be used. So it's hard to give a strict number on how much bandwidth you need and the hardware capabilities of your VPN based on number of users, because it really depends on the traffic that they're generating. It really depends on the what they're doing on the machine, essentially. So like architects use a ton of bandwidth with all their applications and stuff. If you're doing video editing, you're going to need extremely low latency, so you'll need a better connection. Things like that really come into play. So this is a report, or part of a report generated by Shodan. And you can see that while there are not many Windows XP machines, there are more than 0 XP machines. Now, this is not every Windows XP machine that's just connected to the internet. That's not what Shodan is showing me here. It's showing me specifically every Windows XP machine in New York that it had scanned that had RDP exposed. Now, really bad thing is, I hope we all recognize that Windows XP is out of support. I hope we all recognize Windows 7 is out of support as well, and Server 2008 and Server 2003, all out of support. So any vulnerabilities that exist in those products are going to continue to exist in those products. So when you open Windows XP RDP to the internet, there's vulnerabilities there. There's things I can compromise and I'll be in faster than you with a password. That's a really bad system to implement. Now, the scary part is that these places running Windows XP or running Server 2003 are usually running it because it's important. They're running it because they have to, because some legacy product runs on it, or it's a server operating their authentication. Something important is probably running on that. Otherwise, it would have been really easy for them to take it down and not leave the connection open. So seeing that obvious problem, I'm not saying I don't have clients that still run Windows XP. There are a couple clients that have Windows XP machines. However, they are behind firewalls and they are so protected, and they are really just used for running like a legacy application for a dot matrix printer that we still have to use, unfortunately. Although dot matrix printers are cool. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So some other horror stories actually was brought up during the pandemic. So the client taking home the desktops, obviously the worst thing I've ever experienced. No, that isn't the worst thing. It's up there though. When they take them home, I no longer have access and now they can't authenticate anymore. Probably pretty close to as bad as that. Yeah, I'd say pretty close to as bad as that is when people started installing or start trying to install software onto their computers for remote access. And instead of their internal IT saying, no, we're going to manage that, the users kept complaining it wouldn't work, and IT couldn't keep up with the requests to install all the applications. So they just started giving everyone local admin privileges on their account so that they'd be able to install it. So now you had a remote desktop protocol or a remote desktop program installed with local admin privileges, and then IT told me that they removed all of the admin privileges from the users after they installed the products, but you can just run an authentication audit and you can see that they all were still logging in with local admins. That's actually what happened to one of my clients in Australia. Local admin access on his computer. We didn't fully manage it, we just monitored the security of it. And all of a sudden we get an alert, ransomware detected. Now, we have a couple layered approach to stopping and preventing these attacks. However, it got through some of my protection, got through more of my protection than I would have preferred. Not far enough for me to actually get super concerned, but enough that I isolated the device and we had to immediately take a look at it. Turns out that user had given TeamViewer access to a third-party vendor to install an application, and that user still had his remote or his local admin privileges. So when the remote or the vendor installed an application onto the machine, he actually wound up installing malware. Now, the vendor actually turned out to be legitimate, and we just think that there was malware on the vendor's machine, which wound up infecting my client's machine when he pulled over the EXEs to install the applications. But then ransomware got on his machine. It tried, and we were able to see all the network logs that we were blocking. It tried to get to the main domain server for that company so that it can infect group policy and push out a group policy to deploy ransomware to the rest of the company. Wasn't successful. So it started installing applications to exfiltrate the data from his machine. Now, luckily, we have very aggressive policies on that company, but if we didn't, we wouldn't have been able to detect that as fast as we did, and data could have left his computer. One other thing I'll mention on that, that's not directly related to remote access, but we isolated the device, we locked it down, and then we get an activity alert. Somebody plugged a USB into the computer. Now, we still had the USB enabled on that computer because we were using it to run some diagnostics. We had them take a clean USB and put some software on it that we needed, and then plug it into that computer because that computer no longer had internet access. So we see a USB plugged in that wasn't ours, and then we see the auto run file get overwritten and the ransomware move to the USB. So I call them and I ask them if they plugged in a USB. And the tech who was working on the support side to get the user set back up and move him over to a new computer told me, yeah, I told him to plug that in and take off any files he needed, but don't worry, I know there's malware, so I told him not to plug it into anything. Well, I don't know if you've ever met an end user, but an end user is not going to follow instructions, especially if they now have a hard drive with the files that they need sitting on it that you just told them don't plug into anything. So as soon as he told me that, disabled USB ports for the rest of the company on every one of their machines. We didn't see him actually try to plug it in, but at that point, you really can't trust the user. And then I asked him, okay, so how's that user going to get data off of that hard drive if you told him to never plug it in anywhere? And it was silence. So then we actually had to go in, we sanitized the hard drive. We were able to set up a sandbox machine and get what we needed off of there while it was secure and make sure nothing came with it. We were able to just take the raw files, which isn't generally something we like to do, but these were files that were irreparable. We couldn't lose them. So we had to take them off and then we isolate the machine again. Basically, we responded to that. But the users and even tech support, people doing first line support, aren't necessarily thinking about that, aren't necessarily thinking about what needs to be done to properly secure these machines. So I've already started talking about ransomware, but we've seen a massive increase in ransomware with the I shouldn't say fines, the extortion or the blackmail attempts. The numbers are getting absolutely insane. There was actually, so I'm going to tell a little personal story of my data being stolen with ransomware, not by a company I manage. I would never admit to that. So a company that my previous school had worked with to give all of our data to, actually got breached. Now, the scary part is that in their statement, they said that they were breached in February. I think it was February 7th they were breached. They didn't discover the breach until May 20th. Now, for anyone counting, that's a long period of time. They had someone in their system for that long period of time, and they didn't realize it. Now, their statement was the scariest thing I've ever read. Their statement said that they have the best cybersecurity experts working at their company. They responded quickly once they discovered the threat to mitigate anything and stop them from doing any damage. You took several months to find out there was a threat. You don't get to play the "you have the best cybersecurity experts" card anymore. Now, what scared me even more is that they said, well, they had access for the entire time, but we think they only got a backup file that didn't have any real information in it. And then they said that they paid the ransom against everyone's recommendation. They paid the ransom to these attackers. They then told us in the email, don't worry, we have confirmed with the attacker that they have deleted all of the data they took from our machine. That is the single most naive thing that a company has ever said. And I am so glad they are not one of my clients. If you get your data stolen with ransomware, or you get your data stolen with any type of malware, you should never, ever, ever trust the attacker. The attacker is incentivized to lie. The attacker also now knows that company will pay ransoms. They also know that if they just say, hey, we still have the data, they could probably get more money out of that company because that company very clearly doesn't want to lose that data. It was an extremely poorly written statement that I genuinely want to know who was on the board or who read over that statement and said, yeah, that sounds like we did a good job. And that's a personal experience of my data that was breached. I've had clients who came to me after they were breached, and now we manage their security, where we took over for their ransomware and they were basically being blackmailed. The new fun thing with ransomware is not only you lose your data if you don't pay, it's now we'll release your data if you don't pay. And this has proven very effective because the only thing scarier than losing all of your company data is having all of your company data put on the internet for everybody to see your client information, your employee information, everything. That's terrifying for a business. That's ending for a business. Ransomware attacks are probably happening on your computer without you even realizing it. Windows Defender has come a long way and does a great job of protecting you. You'll probably see notifications that it block threats. You probably might have low-level ransomware from plugging in USBs. In our 4,500 devices that we control, we clear about 60 threats a day. Now, most of these threats, if I'm being completely honest, come in from people downloading emails. If you get an email, and this is the one I see the most, if you get an email that says unpaid invoice, urgent, bunch of exclamation points, and you don't have an invoice that needs to be paid, don't click it. I've had a user keep clicking the link, and it kept popping up. Our antivirus kept notifying them, hey, you have something malicious there. Don't do that again. Did it several times, over and over and over again. And we get the alert, ping, 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 alerts that this user is doing something. So we immediately lock the user out. Turns out he was just the bill processor, so anything that went to his email, he just assumed was legitimate because it was supposed to be forwarded from other people. So he just kept trying to download this exe, thinking it was an invoice because he had no knowledge of the fact that an exe is not a document. And even if it was a document, those can contain viruses too. But he kept trying to download it and infect his machine. So luckily we were able to stop that, but we have very aggressive policies in place. A lot of people will think, oh, I have an antivirus, I'm good to go. That's absolutely not the case. We have threats that get past our normal antivirus on a fairly regular basis. One of the things that we're able to deploy with enterprise protection is actually our enterprise pattern recognition and sandbox. So instead of just looking at if a file is known as malicious, it's now looking for patterns. It's seeing what that file does and making sure to track it back and making sure that the file actually that the file isn't going to do anything permissive once it gets onto their system. So drive services protect users in a broad sense. So the difficult part about protecting users from drive services is drive services, especially paid ones, if you use like Enterprise Google Drive, want limited access to your files, or you want them to have limited access to your files. So part of what you have to do is balance do I want them to be able to access my files so they can scan them for something malicious, or do I want my files to be kept safe and secure only from me? So a lot of clients that we see getting viruses from malware actually have shared Dropbox folders or Google File Stream or something on their machine. And then we pick it up with our antivirus. Now, the great thing that Google or Dropbox will do is if our antivirus deletes it from their Dropbox, it'll actually save it back to their computer because it'll think that it got accidentally deleted and it'll resync and the file will come back to their computer over and over and over again. So what we have to do is we actually have to monitor these alerts, and we have alerts set up specifically for if it's coming from a drive or a Dropbox, so that we can then say, okay, we need access to that, or you need to delete that file from your Dropbox. Because realistically, that Dropbox is probably linked to multiple computers, or they might even go to their personal computer and go and download a file, and then their personal computer could be infected, which now that people are working from home could make their entire network infected and is an even bigger issue. So RDP, which most people wind up using because it's easy, there's a couple of tools that you can actually install to secure your RDP a little more. And I think I have the slide on them at the end of this. RDP on itself is an insecure protocol. So one of the things that people think is, okay, I have a really strong password. And one of the problems is that a strong password doesn't always protect you because as an attacker, I'm not always logging in with a password. The attack that I'm doing isn't always necessarily brute forcing. Brute forcing would be trying passwords over and over again until I get it. So in those situations, having a strong password wouldn't protect you because I'm now attacking the program, the protocol itself to get access to your system. But there are a couple of applications that you can install that'll help block any incoming connections from certain IP addresses, that'll lock accounts out after multiple failed attempts. By default, RDP actually only puts the logs of failed attempts in your event viewer, which most people don't go and regularly view. Nobody's going into their event viewer to check what's going on with their computer. Really, realistically, most people see an event viewer for the first time when they're watching a YouTube video of like a scammer online trying to infect your computer, and they show like, oh, look at all these errors that are occurring, and it's them causing the errors. But realistically, end users aren't going into that. So for someone trying to personally protect their machine, you should install another application to monitor and block these connections. My actual recommendation for secure access to your machine is not to use remote desktop protocol or Windows remote desktop protocol if you don't have a proper VPN. I would never expose Windows remote desktop protocol over the internet if it's not on an enterprise system and not hidden behind a VPN. So for a personal user, or even for companies, small businesses that are trying to save money, I would use maybe a free or a low cost, inexpensive alternative so that you're completely bypassing Windows desktop. AnyDesk has a really affordable plan. A lot of these companies are offering free plans for like under 5 users or something like that. Remote PC is another good one. I think their pricing is like $20 or $5 for 20 users for a year or something like that. There's a couple of really good companies out there making good strides, and you should always look for ones that have been reviewed by like tech magazines or tech websites and stuff. How do you fight stupidity? Stupidity can't be fought with. You cannot win against stupidity. What you can do is lock systems down. Completely unrelated to remote access, but the dumbest thing and also the smartest thing at the exact same time that I have ever seen somebody do is they had barcode scanners at their workstations, and they used that to log into they logged in from their computers there, and they were on the warehouse floor. What they started doing instead of actually setting new passwords is, because the barcode reader is just read as a USB keyboard, they would actually just pick an item, and when they had to change their password, they would just scan that barcode. So like they would flip the phone over and use the barcode from the phone as their login. So all they had to do was scan the phone to log into the computer. It was single-handedly the dumbest and smartest thing I've ever seen done by an end user. Solution to that was to make sure that their manager spoke to them, because not everything is an IT problem. Some of it's a management problem, despite the fact that managers try to make everything an IT problem. And then we locked out that device so that it couldn't be used before the user had logged in. So fighting stupidity really comes down to putting management in place where managers are actually having proper oversight of their employees, and putting tools and group policy or putting security measures in place to stop people from making decisions. Like I had mentioned, everyone falls victim to ransomware. The bigger ones are the ones we hear about, but small businesses fall victim to ransomware every single day. A lot of them wind up having to pay the ransom because a small business doesn't have necessarily the backups in place, off-site backups or backups not connected to the network. So they wind up having to pay for this ransomware. And we're seeing that more and more as COVID occurs, because now it's even worse, because now people are working from home. Garmin just got hacked. They just confirmed that they were attacked with ransomware. And I have to say, I am sorry if anyone here works or is associated with Garmin, but their PR statement was the worst thing I have ever seen. It took them way too long to confirm that there was an attack. It took them way too long to acknowledge their outage. And the fact that it was capable of dropping their mail servers, their support lines, their connection to their server, to the watches, basically everything, shows that they had very little segmentation, or somebody was using a privileged account that was infected, and then that managed to spread and infect everything else. Either way, policies were either non-existent, not followed, or just people made workarounds that became permanent fixes, and nobody went back and fixed any of them. So business change control policies. I could do a whole day talking about policies and talking about how we change things. The most important thing, and I'm going to just reiterate this over and over again, is speak to the people who are actually qualified to approve changes. If we're talking about from an administrative standpoint and getting change orders and like least privilege, granting users access and things, we want to make sure that that's actually coming from somebody who has the know how to make that decision. You don't want just a manager saying, yeah, this person needs access to this, and this, and this. you want it to kind of come with the role and say, okay, well, they have this role, so they need access to modify this. They need to be able to read these files. We want granular control to make sure that nobody is given too much permission on the system. We want procedures and logging in place to monitor everything that's changed. We want to make sure that files are remaining or have high integrity so that they're not being changed or modified by anyone that shouldn't change them. For our backup servers, we basically set them so that only certain processes can write to them, and then any changes that don't occur on our schedules or any changes that occur that are irregular get flagged immediately and get investigated. But to be honest, there's huge expenses associated with all these things. I could stand here and tell you that there's a great way to do it, and stand here and tell you that there's a perfect plan. But the very truth of the nature is that there's not a perfect plan, that it's expensive to implement these changes, and it's expensive to do it the proper way. But it's more expensive to not do it the proper way and get breached. I've been speaking a lot about ransomware, but I'm just going to point to the RDP port. Pulling this data from Shodan, if we were looking at it, we saw that there was a decline, and then there was a spike, and we had no decline. And now, if we were to pull this data out till now, we'd see an increased amount of RDP available to the internet. And that's really a terrifying fact. The fact that RDP is still widely used and it's still being widely implemented as a valid way to expose computers to the internet. Let's see. So just to wrap up, looking forward, companies need to focus on hybrid. Cloud has come a very long way. Cloud is now affordable and scalable, which is the biggest thing. Microsoft has virtual desktops. Amazon has workspaces. Both allow you to very quickly and cheaply deploy virtual desktop experiences to your employees and have them log in securely. Both have their own way to securely log users in. Amazon's is a little bit more succinct if you don't have an Office 365 subscription already. Then you just download their application, you log in, but it's highly scalable and it's controllable and manageable from one central point. And it should already be something you're thinking about with your business continuity. If your location is no longer accessible or you can no longer have people working from there, how do you respond to that? So really implementing some cloud control and implementing some features in the cloud in order to scale this, in order to make it so that if a server in your office goes down, you didn't lose access to all the files. And then lingering problems, securing an employee's network and an employee's device. I mean, we run into this problem now with companies not being able to provide as many devices or not wanting to. And you really have to watch out what control you implement on their device because it's their personal device, you can't lock everything down. And you have to worry about the other devices on their network. I think am I getting is that the end?
Yeah, you're doing very well, Christopher. Thank you very much. You've caught up really for all the questions that we have, and your presentation was excellent. Thank you very much for sharing. Did you want to add something else to your talk?
No, this was right at the end. I think I hit everything I wanted to hit. I think I was trying to keep track of questions. I think I hit most of them.
Yes, you did a very good job. I couldn't keep up with you, so you did great.